Parts. We've got parts. Alright, so let's get to the hardware. Starting off with the motherboard, we're going with the Asus Prime X570p AM4 socket. Now, what does that mean? Think of the X570 as a generation number. Prior to that, there was an X470, which is still available and still a very viable board. There's also a B series, which is a similar board, will fit the same socket type or processor. However, it just has a few less features than the X series. For this build, I originally looked at an X470 board for price comparison, and I found the X570 to be the exact same price. So I went with the X570 for the added features and future compatibility with the new 5000 series Ryzen processors. So that's why I went with this particular board. Choice of manufacturers, I like Asus. I've been using their boards in the past quite a bit. I also enjoy using MSI boards. I find that they're a very solid board to work with. This one stood out, and I've been wanting to play with this one for a while, so when I saw the price come down on it, I took it. Okay, onto the processors. We are going with the AMD Ryzen 3600X. This is the AM4 socket that fits into the motherboard. One thing you need to be careful of is to really read the socket type on the motherboard when you're choosing motherboards. If it says an AM4 socket, that is AMD compatible. Anything else will be Intel. So you just have to keep your eye on what socket type you are looking at, and you have to buy a compatible CPU to go with it. So we chose the 3600X. There isn't a lot of performance difference between the 3600X and the 3600. I actually found this on sale for less than the stock 3600, so I decided to go with it. This is a 6-core 12-thread processor, 3.8 gigahertz base speed with a 4.4 gigahertz boost, and that just denotes the speed at which the processor will run. If you're wondering what a processor is in a computer, think of this as the brain, the guy that does a lot of the thinking. So obviously the faster it is, the quicker your system will run. Again, make sure it's compatible with your motherboard, and you shouldn't have any issues. On to graphics. Going with the Asus actually, the RTX 2060. 6 gig of memory on this board. It's more than enough power for what I need it to do, and we're looking at a price to performance ratio here. We're not trying to build an outstanding supercomputer. It will game on everything 4K, 120 frames per second. We're just looking for something that's a good system at a good price. With the introduction of the 30 series from GeForce, the price in the 20s have actually gone down. I can't recall exactly the price. I'll list them all in the description below. But this processor is more than enough juice for what I need it to do, and on top of that, it pairs very well with the Ryzen. You have to take bottlenecking into account when you're picking out processors versus GPUs. You want a fast GPU to process your graphics. However, all that processing has to run through your CPU first. So if you've got an extremely fast GPU and an extremely slow CPU, your graphics card is going to be sitting there waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting for your processor to send it information. So you want something that's fairly paired well something that's going to keep up with each other. At the end of the day, what you want is your CPU to be working at 100% and your GPU to be running at a solid 70-80%. And that's a good pairing where you know your video card is working hard to keep up with your processor. That means your system is running fairly optimal. What you don't want to see is a higher end GPU. If I paired this with, say, a 3080, 3090 with that CPU, the GPU would probably be working at about 30 or 40%. So that's 60-70% of my GPU that I've paid for that I'm not using. So you want to make sure you pair it with an appropriate CPU. 20 series, great cards, can't go wrong. I went with the lower end because it's more than enough for what I need it for, and I think this is going to pair very well with that system. Hard drives. There's essentially three types of hard drives that you can get. There is a mechanical drive, which is an actual disk inside of a metal box, and the disk spins and there's a laser that reads it. They're very high capacity, but they're very slow. The second is a solid state drive, which is just a collection of memory chips that will pull memory up quite a bit faster. But in your standard SSD, it's a lot faster than a mechanical drive, but you generally get lower capacity drives. Now that is starting to change. We're starting to see them a lot higher. What I've gone with was a NVMe drive, which is also a SSD or a solid state drive. However, this one, instead of being plugged in through a data cable that runs the data to your motherboard, this is the NVMe output is actually plugged directly onto your motherboard and takes advantage of the PCI Express capabilities on the motherboard. You're not bottlenecked by a cable. So by far the best motherboards as far as speed that you can get. And I've gone with a 500 gig, which is going to be plenty for my operating system and a handful of games and some recording software. If I need more space, I will add a mechanical high capacity 2, 3, 4 terabyte drive, and I will add that as a dump drive where I don't need the speed for that particular drive. This drive is going to handle most of my programs, and I want them to boot up and run as quickly as possible. So that's why I would highly recommend going with an NVMe drive. Memory. We're going with a 32 gigabyte of 3600 megahertz T-Force Delta. I've never used T-Force in the past. I've seen mixed reviews on it. The price is excellent on it. The RGB was great, a nice little option. I'm not sold on RGB. I don't need to absolutely have RGB in my systems. But if it comes there and it's not costing me too much extra, I'll add a little flair to the case, sure. 3600 megahertz speed is a very good speed for this particular system. It's going to pair well with the CPU. It won't run natively out of the X570 motherboard. However, we'll have to overclock manually in the system, or perhaps maybe not manually. If you can turn on the XMP profile, this memory should read automatically at least 3200 megahertz, if not 3600 megahertz. We'll find that out when we put the build together. And in a separate video, I will actually be going through some tweaks, things you're going to need to software that's going to be helpful to you, and how to do those little simple overclocks and tweaks in your BIOS to get the most performance out of what you're paying for. So that's the memory we're going with. And powering it, pretty straightforward. It's a Thermaltake 700 watt power supply. Power supplies are not really something you need to put a whole lot of knowledge into. You just have to make sure that you've got more than enough power that you need. If you're wondering how much is enough, a good starting point is looking at your GPU, your graphics processor, the 2060 in the case of this build, and look at the manufacturer's recommended wattage. I believe on the 2060 it's at least I think it's around 500 watts it recommends. I think that model might be actually 450. And then all your other components are going to draw power as well. So you got to make sure you have enough power to run all of your components, and then add on at least another 20%. It's typically, with today's modern computers, anything between a 700 and a 900 should be more than enough to power most systems, unless you're going to start adding in a lot of peripherals, a lot of extra hard drives. Then you may want to look at bumping it up by at least 100 watts, but that should get you by. All right, that's the components and why we chose them. Let's start getting to the build. Okay, so now that we've got the motherboard out, one of the first things you're going to want to do is remove the screws on these mounting plates. I'm not sure why. I guess they're included in case you're going to do any kind of off-standard air cooling. And the back plate should fall right off. Grab the CPU. Okay, so this is the Ryzen 3600X die. First of all, make sure you've got your swing arm out of the way. And in the top corner here, you're going to see a little indicate on the socket, and on the actual die, you're going to see that one of the corners is marked differently. Those got to line up. Should sit fairly easy. Ask your cat to come help you. Fur is not good for PCs, by the way. Alright, now we're going to get our memory in. The memory is airproof to only go in one direction. You see the slot is off center, so you can't accidentally put it the wrong way. This will be your A channel, your B channel, and slots 1, 2, 3, and 4. So you want the memory to be inserted in pairs. So you see this can only go in one way. And just kind of hold the board and give it a push. Make sure your lock is pulled up on the other side, and you're going to want the memory in just slots 1 and 3. And then plug in your fan connector. And I think we're just about ready to put this into a case. Okay, so we got our motherboard out. We've got our memory sticks installed. We have our CPU with our CPU cooler and the fan plugged into the header on the motherboard. Next we're going to put in the NVMe hard drive. Now this particular motherboard comes with a small standoff that actually needs to be screwed in here if I don't drop them. And these just kind of lift the SSD off the board a little bit. I'm assuming that's probably for some cooling. The chip goes in, sits down, and then there's just a small screw that will keep it all together Why do they have to make these screws so small? Yeah, see what I mean? I think I might have the wrong tool for the job too. So that's it, just get snugged down. Okay, looks like we have all of our components in. Let's get a case and put it in the case. Okay, now this obviously is not the case that I'm going to keep a shiny, nice new system in like this. This is just an open air chassis that I had laying around that for the sake of this video, we're going to put it in here. We are going to do a video in the future where we do take a nice new shiny case and get it all lit up and looking good. But for today, we're just going to put it in this case for the sake of the video here. Okay, so it's your motherboard, and what you'll see on the case is there are these standoffs every so often, and this corresponds with the holes in the motherboard. This is where you're going to need to screw your board down to those standoffs. Normally this is where you would put your I/O shield into the back of your case. This will be the same size and shape as the motherboard, so it can fit all your USB plugs, your LAN cables, things like that. But since this is obviously not going to stay in this case, we're not putting it in. This is your top PCI Express slot right here. This is where you're going to want to put it. It does come with a second one. Don't put it in the second one. Trust me, put it in the top one. Oh, this is definitely a tight squeeze. I actually got to be down one. There we go. You kind of might want to be looking through the back of the case to line up the slots on the PCI Express to make sure that you're actually getting them both in the right spot. And you'll feel it sink in, and you'll see this little switch right here. I know you probably can't see that now. That's for the second PCI Express. That will actually flip up when you're in the right spot. So now that we've got that in and seated, we're going to screw mount right here and then flip our I/O lock back up. Okay, it's time to throw in the power supply and give a little juice to this whole project. It's not nearly as complicated as it looks. First of all, just throw all this aside. All you really need to worry about in the beginning is getting the box into place. There are 4 screws back here that I will screw in after I get the cables where I need them to be. Okay, essential cables. 24-pin motherboard cable, which is going to go up here. 8-pin GPU power supply, which is going to go right here. I've lost the other one. Oh, here we go. And that's the other 8-pin for the motherboard, which will sit up top right behind these heat sinks. Now, I'm not going to bother to try and cable manage this, so don't bust me too bad. I absolutely despise poorly cable managed cases. But this one is only going to be in it for a couple of weeks, so I'm just not going to look at it. Each one of the plugs pretty much only fits, for the most part, in the place that it goes. So you have a pretty slim chance of putting something where it doesn't belong. So that is essentially it. 8-pin motherboard, 24-pin motherboard, and 8-pin GPU. I have a ton of SATA and accessory cables right now with the onboard NVMe drive. I'm not going to need any of these, so I'm just going to tuck those aside. Plug in your power cable. While we have it flipped over, plug in your keyboard, plug in your mouse, and then plug in your, in my case, a display port into your GPU. And that's it. Let's fire it up, see what works. Okay, now you're into your BIOS after starting up your PC for the first time. One of the first things you're going to want to look for is your flash utility. This will flash your BIOS or update your BIOS to the latest version. This will help with any stability issues in the future. Next, you're going to want to look for your AI tweaker or where your memory settings are. You're going to want to find the DOCP, enable it, and then check the memory frequency that it matches the memory that you've purchased. That covers the basics behind PC building. If you have any comments or questions, leave them down below, and good luck on your future build. Thanks for watching, guys.